All right, and if you're still here, let's talk about Richard Bartle's Designing Virtual Worlds. Today, we're going to review this book. I'm also working with another video editor to try to make videos on my old style as well, because I also miss talking about the contents and the subject matters that aren't just reviewing books. But without further ado, let's talk about this book. This is a great book. This is a great book. Spoiler alert, you should read this book. If you are into game design, you should absolutely read this book. You should also read a lot of other books as well. There's a lot you need to do if you are into game design. But if you don't know, Richard Bartle is the guy who sort of coined the idea of dividing. My bookmarker just fell. The idea of dividing player. How do I talk about this? All right. So before I kind of came across his work, I sort of only looked at games from a very simple perspective, which was you're a designer, you create your world, there's the experience that you kind of want the individual to have, and then the individual plays with your content and they have that experience, right? And then I started reading guys like Crawford and Huizinga and yada yada, and you sort of start to realize, well, it's not really what you want the player to have to experience. It's like the player comes to your game with their own biases, with their own personality. And the act of playing a game is in some ways an extension of their personality. They play their game because there's something about them that makes them want to play. And you can spark with curiosity, marketing, a friend's recommendation, but at the end of the day, a player plays because they choose to play. And there's something in them that compels them to interact and play around, because inside the game world and that virtual world, the player is behaving as an avatar, but in some ways they're behaving as aspects of themselves that they might not be able to behave in the real world, or because they might not be able to express and experience certain things that they can't in that world. And so when you talk, the classic thing that I used to look at when I was playing, Grand Theft Auto back in the day was, oh, you can sort of kill people and do bad things inside video games, right? You have this freedom to do those things, right? But Bartle took it to another step with this book. And what's interesting about this book, and it's actually a lengthy one, there's a ton of pages and the font is rather small, so there's a lot of content in this book. And the interesting thing is, like, he starts off with, like, okay, in the beginning of multiplayer games, MUDs, right, multi-user dungeons, he's like, I think he was one of the first folks to actually partake in the construction of the original MUDs, before pre-internet, like BBC news groups, that kind of stuff, right? And he talks about how they started, the evolution of them. Like, he really starts from the beginning of how virtual worlds became to be designed. He doesn't start with, like, let's take a look at World of Warcraft, right? He starts right from the first users that started playing around, the libraries they started constructing, and the patterns that began to emerge naturally as people were experimenting with these kinds of games. And he highlights how each one of these different MUDs had different kind of characteristics that induced different kinds of player behaviors. And so out of that sheer chaos that was spawning, he started getting a bunch of survey data and looking at it, and he noticed a pattern, a really interesting pattern. And pretty much the entire book after that talks about that pattern. And it's sort of what made Richard Bartle famous, because a lot of books and a lot of theory after that followed sort of builds on top of that. And then with other books that I'll revise one day in the future, kind of deconstructs that, which is really interesting. But we'll talk about those in another day. But basically what Bartle said is, like, when a person enters a multiplayer game, a multi-user dungeon, a virtual world, and it's an environment where this individual can interact with other individuals, and there are some sort of social norms or ethics in there, by necessity, you're going to start having some players that are going to start behaving in one of four ways. And he divides those players into achievers, socializers, killers, and I think it was completionists, the fourth one. I can't recall the last one. It was, just a second. It was killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers. That was the four group, and he starts talking about them. About okay, when a player, but not just these four groups in themselves, but entire relationships and how someone starts as one and then migrates to the other. So in essence, it's like okay, first let's define what each group is, right? So a killer is a person that just wants to kill other players, right? But it's not necessarily just trying to kill another player. It's a person that's trying to gain advantage over other players. That's the core idea. There's achievers. It's an individual who's trying to achieve something that is difficult to do, right? Or maybe get some loot that you can't really get all the time, or find a situation. It's like when, you know, the Star Wars Galaxies MMO came out, and everybody was trying to figure out who would be the first Jedi, right? And you had those hardcore achievers, completionists, right, who wanted to get to that level. They're socializers, who are individuals who are in there to just as a means to interact and talk with other individuals. The game is just a background to that element. And then there's explorers. It's individuals who want to say, okay, what is inside this world? What can I do? What can I play? They're sort of tinkering with that element. And right from the get-go, when I started reading about that, I thought, oh wow, you can easily think of some group of friends that, like, I know a guy who's a killer. He has to have advantage over everybody else. It's what makes him feel good, right? I'm more of, I guess, an explorer. I'm interested in figuring out what's going on and seeing the mechanics. I don't really care about feeling good over beating someone else or achieving a really difficult thing to do. It's more like the experience that I'm kind of interested in on the average. But he starts off with the gecko from there. But what's interesting enough, he also starts talking about, the author, Richard Bartle, starts talking about, okay, what reality is not that you have these different groups of personality. It's that as players are interacting with your game, as the experience of the game matures, so the individuals start to transition from one spot to the other. So he highlighted, on average, people try to be explorers in the beginning, then they sort of become achievers. Then once they got a good know-how and they know what to do, they sort of transition to killers. And then over time, they sort of become socializers. Like, I know I could kill someone if I wanted to, if I put my mind to it. I'd rather just have fun in other ways. So it's interesting how he talks about people transitioning from one mode to the other. But the other interesting thing that he talks about is like, hey, people are going to approach your game from a different perspective right from the get-go. And you just need to think of your game as an extension of their personality. And how can your game encompass all of that, right? So if you're designing a virtual world, how can you have elements about your game that are for achievers, that are for completionists, that are for killers, that are for socializers, you know? Because if you remove one of those, you're just going to have this massive, not only going to have a massive audience that are not just going to be able to interact with your game, but you're going to sort of miss one of the steps of an individual being able to grow and evolve in your game, right? So if you have, that's one of the interesting things I look at games like, for example, the original Quake, and Quake 1, Quake 2, and Unreal Tournament, right? People played those games to death, and there was this component of achievement, of killing other folks. There wasn't really a lot of socializing, right? It's like, okay, after I got a good, like, what is the after practice locker room chit-chat equivalent of a Unreal Tournament match, right? There really wasn't one about it. But then when you look at a game like League of Legends, you have that. Like, the game is over, and then you have the after screen where it shows the stats from everybody who killed the most. You can sort of say, good game, everyone. You can kind of talk shit about someone else. And then there's the act of, okay, what's the next game? So it's really interesting that League of Legends has this capacity to say, okay, you can sort of, within an hour and a half or the hour in which you play a game, you can sort of transition from these various modalities and then back to where you were from the start, which is, I think it's one of the reasons why people get so hooked, right? You get your adrenaline pumping, you're a killer, you're trying to achieve, and then it's over, you can socialize, and then you can sort of recoup, and you get back at it. But then when you go back, it's like, okay, what is the next thing I want to achieve? What is the next thing I want to kill? What is the... And so you're not really back at square one. So you're constantly having this arc of development that the author, Bartle, talks about in this book at length. And he talks about tons of games throughout the years that most people haven't even heard if they weren't in the right place or the right location. And just says, okay, this one game you had permadeath, right? What was the consequence of that? This one game everybody spawned in a particular place. What was the consequence of that? This one game didn't really have a lot of achievements. What was the consequence of that? And so it's interesting for you to be able to see a game as a mechanism of constructing different experiences that individuals can have, and then seeing the consequence of those experiences, not just as a direct input of the design you're trying to construct, but also this meta language that you're constructing, right? When you're saying, okay, I'm trying to construct something for an achiever, for a completionist, for a socializer or a killer or whatever. But the interesting thing about this book also is that it sort of opens your mind to the idea of being able to dissect groups of players into different groups. Now, Bartle doesn't talk a lot about that, but he sort of talks about that idea in itself, right? And you can sort of see, okay, I'm creating a game. What are the completionists in my game? What are the killers? But, and other books talk about this at greater length, and I'll talk about those next time, which is like, okay, not only how are you capable of using Bartle's model to understand your audience, but how are you capable of constructing your own model for your own audience? Because every audience is unique about every single game that you're trying to develop, right? So this book doesn't really teach you that, but it's a great case study of many times in which that was done. And so you can sort of derive that knowledge, the domain of knowledge for yourself. Besides that, there's just this immense amount of trivia and common knowledge that as a game creator you can sort of have when you're constructing multiplayer games, right? It's like, okay, how do you sort of control foul language? How do you control ethical behaviors? Gender disparities in game, like all sorts of things that sort of pop up, and the moment you say, I'm going to make a game where people can interact with, right? And so it's really interesting perspective about Richard Bartle on this, and it sort of opens your mind to being able to design games in ways other than just what do I want the user to experience, right? It's how do I make something that is an extension of the user and of themselves, and how do I allow, as that extension of the user and as the user grows within my game, how do I allow my game to grow with that user and constantly be providing something for that user that entertains them, be it they're transitioning from a killer to a socializer or just the most hardcore extreme killer, right? How can you have this individual have fun if that individual is socializing with another individual that wants to be the most socializer of them all? And you've seen some tactics in various games to try to do that, right? Some successful, others not so much. But it's a really interesting take. And so if you're interested in a really analytical perspective on how to construct multiplayer games in terms of audiences, this is the book you should read. And with that, that's the review. So go read it. Like, seriously, you should totally, like, everybody's making multiplayer. Well, not everybody. A lot of folks are making multiplayer games. And so it's always useful for you to have a little bit of extra domain knowledge in an area whenever you can. And that is that with this book. Sorry everyone that had their speakers on with that loud bang. Let me know what else you'd like me to review. This was a request by a user. I forgot his or her name, but I'm gonna do a shout out. Because if that person was like, hey Daltre, review this book, and so I'm gonna give you a shout out to Daniel Sharps. Alright, Daniel Sharps, you now owe me. One day I will come with a favor, and you better oblige, or you're gonna wake up with some, like, horse's head in your bed. I hope people understand that reference. As I'm getting older, I'm realizing that some references not everybody's getting. I was hanging out with a couple of kids that were like 20-year-olds this past weekend, and I was like, man, that's a really MacGyver moment right there. And they all blank stared at me. And I was like, man, they don't know what MacGyver is, nor Thundercats, or Saint Seiya. Like, of all the shit that they're remaking, why don't they remake the good stuff, right? It's like, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was crap. I didn't see it, but I just saw the trailer. I was like, I know crap when I see it. I don't have to experience it to know that it is crap, right? It's like, they should remake stuff. Don't remake Back to the Future. That one is my holy grail. Like, just don't touch it. Like, seriously. Of all things, Michael Bay wants to touch from the 80s. I will go to his house. I'll be like, Michael Bay, no. No, this is an intervention. Just slap him in the face repeatedly until he figures out it's a bad idea. So no Back to the Future remakes and Designing Virtual Worlds by the one and only Richard Bartle. See you later.